Greetings friends, welcome to our digital workflow. In this episode, we're going to jump into Lightroom and start exploring the images from the beautiful Aspen forest. I can't wait to get started, so let us begin. All right, friends, welcome back to another Lightroom tutorial. We are going to launch into our beautiful Aspen forest, so let's get going. Now, when we bring up our thumbnails, let's take another look at the scene here. If you will recall, we used a telephoto lens to shoot kind of a long, narrow panorama of this Aspen forest. And we also did our due diligence and shot bracketed frames. So if we look over here on the left, we have a dark frame going to a slightly darker frame. Number 3 ends up being a little bit more medium for our midtones. 4 and 5 kind of round out a little bit brighter on the spectrum. And as such, we have 3 panels for our panoramic image. So the top is going to represent panel 1, this will represent panel 2 for the center, and then this will represent panel 3 for the right-hand side. Now, I know that this forest can look a little bit daunting as we view it here in thumbnail mode, but I can actually promise you that this is going to be one of the easier projects that we've done thus far. Up until now, we have definitely been combining multiple raw files in order to generate a huge amount of dynamic range. And the reason is because when we go out and shoot big ticket landscape with valley, forest, mountain, clouds, and sky, we have a lot of exposure variation happening there. The sun quite often hits the sky, it illuminates the clouds, and they become immensely brighter than the actual landscape. So we have to combine multiple raw files into our super raw files, as we've been doing, in order to balance that exposure equation. The beauty of this, however, when we go into our Aspen forests, and let's go to about an even exposure there, when we go into the forest on a cloudy day, the clouds overhead actually act as a giant softbox. They kind of flatten out the light and make everything nice and neutral. So in this case, we really are not going to have to combine multiple raw files in order to create one super raw file. I think that even with my old camera, that we can bring out enough information using a single file for each of our panels. So we can effectively skip the super raw HDR component to this workflow. That's going to be great because it's one less thing we have to do and we can get right on over to the fun stuff. So let's go back to all of our thumbnails. I'm going to start up here and I'm going to go through and I'm going to select 3 images that we will use to build out our panorama. Again, I think we can do this with only 3 images because this soft, flat light in the forest is actually going to be very, very kind to our exposure equation. So let's start up here, number 1, and I'm going to start moving on through. This is a little dark, this is a little dark, and this to me feels just about right. I've got good tonality in my bright white aspen trunks here. I've got good tonality in all of this beautiful, beautiful foliage, and I can still sort of see enough information in these little spruce trees that they're not completely getting darkened out on us. So I'm going to say that this right here is a pretty darn good exposure. B, and we're going to send that to the quick collection. So moving on to our next panel, we've got our beautiful sort of central panel here. Once again, I feel like this exposure is going to be just right for everything we need. So let's hit the B key and we'll move on to our next panel. And let's see here, right around here, again, the same exposure. Let's try that. Now, when we look at our quick collection, we should only have 3 panels, and as we move here from left to right, we can start to see our panoramic taking shape, and it does in fact look really, really beautiful to me. I think that we can get everything that we need out of these individual raw files. So let's drop into our development module. Now, when I click on the development module, I can tell that each one of these images is more or less similar enough that we're probably going to be able to develop a single image and then synchronize those edits across the others because the exposure equation is really quite Steven across all of these. So I kind of find the middle to be the most interesting because we have this sort of beautiful spruce tree going up right through the center, and then we have all of these beautiful diagonal aspens cutting across, making these very unusual diagonal lines. So I'm going to concentrate my development efforts on this central panel, and then we'll just copy those edits onto the right and left panels. All right, first things first, when you are out in an aspen forest shooting, even if you have your color temperature set to the correct temperature, so in this case it's kind of a cloudy day, so I had my white balance set for cloudy, That gives us a nice sort of even color tone. But what I am seeing here, and this just comes from experience, but what I'm seeing here is that there actually is a great deal of yellow appearing in all of these aspen trunks. Now we may be looking at this image kind of out of context right now and say, okay, well, that's fine and good, but the aspen trunks kind of look white to me. Well, honestly, they're not as white as they need to be. And the reason is because there's all of this yellow foliage all around, and these white trunks are actually being bombarded with reflected yellow light from all of these yellow leaves. So watch what happens when I grab my simple eyedropper tool here, and I put it on basically a section of the image that's supposed to be a neutral white or a neutral gray. When I click once here, now Lightroom has automatically color tinted the white balance for me. And as you can see, now my aspen trees are definitely white. They actually stand out beautifully from all the rest of the foliage in the forest. Let's undo that and then take a look at it again. I'm going to just hit previous and watch what happens to my aspen trunks. They have literally all become very, very yellow. So now you can tell basically what's happening. Again, there's just a huge amount of ambient yellow light bouncing all around this forest, and the tree trunks are kind of soaking up a lot of that light. And as a result, they don't really vibrantly pop. They don't really stand out from the rest of the forest. So let's once again grab our medicine dropper. And basically what this is going to do, this is Lightroom's way of telling me that I want to basically hone in on a color that's supposed to be a neutral white or a neutral gray, and Lightroom is automatically going to tint our color temperature to get that effect. Let's go ahead and go on this tree right here, and boom, again. So there's our effect again. I feel like this is a really, really, really powerful edit to use. I've definitely done a lot of aspen forests over the years, and as you kind of go back and look at them, sometimes they're in print, you think, man, those trees look really, really yellow. I know that those trunks are supposed to be a bright, vibrant white. So definitely, if you're ever working with aspen trunks, you want to make sure to just go ahead and grab that eyedropper tool and put it on one of your trunks. And Lightroom, in my opinion, does do a very, very good job of balancing out that sort of color temperature equation. All right, so that is a very good first edit. I think we're on to a good start here. So let's just kind of get into the rest of the image. I like to start with my highlights. They tend to be a little burned out in certain places. I can kind of see some areas where I'm looking through the trees and kind of catching a little bit of sky in behind. I really don't like that. I really don't like to see exposure burnouts, but in this case, there's just so much camouflage and so much happening here in these trees. I'm not completely offended by these tiny little bits of exposure burnout up here. All the same, let's grab our highlights and try to bring them down just a little bit. And as you can see, this is affecting the foliage in the forest as I bring these down, because the leaves are kind of like little solar conductors. They're basically just reflecting maximum amount of light throughout the forest. And if they are too bright, we definitely get lots of exposure burnouts. So let's drag these down just a little bit to kind of take the edge off of those highlights a little bit there. All right, that's pretty good. Moving down, I don't know that we need to mess with exposure too much. I think we could probably bring our exposure up just a tad. Let's go 0.25 just to kind of give this scene a little bit of extra brightness. That's nice. I'm going to take my whites and put them up 2 points, because the whites are going to kind of really focus in on these aspen trunks, and we want them to be a vibrant, bright white. A lot of the vibrance in the aspen trunks has to do with Mother Nature. I mean, certain aspen groves tend to be a little bit healthier than others. I've definitely seen a lot where the tree trunks are kind of brown and dead. You can look at this one guy right here. He's not looking like he's in all that good a shape. But for the most part, this grove, all of these trunks are just white and beautiful. They just look like they've been through the car wash, which is definitely what you want to look for when you're out on location. Beautiful, white, pristine trunks. Okay, so let's move right in here. I want to be careful about shadows and blacks right now, because I do not want my very, very dark spruce trees here to completely drop off of the map. If I take my shadows and I drag them down too much, I'm getting that nice contrast in between these sort of like aspen bark here, but I'm also starting to lose a little bit of color information inside of my much, much darker evergreen trees. Now the evergreen trees do provide this beautiful kind of contrasty balance that balances against all of this vibrant forest. But again, I want to be careful about bringing my shadows down too much because I don't want to lose that information. So let's just go a little bit there. Let's keep it maybe -11, and the blacks can also go down just a tad. I do want them to be contrasty, but I don't want them to completely drop off the map. All right, let's move down into some color saturation. This is a very colorful scene, so we have to be careful about adding too much color. Let's just go with 7 points on each. And as you can see, just those quick little 7 points of vibrance and color saturation have really made all of these leaves just explode with electric color. So we may have to be a little bit careful about that. Let's drop down through our scene here. The tone curve is, I would say, in my opinion, it's already naturally very, very contrasty. I mean, we've just got a lot of good contrast happening in here. We can punch this up a little bit. Let's go maybe 5 points up on our highlights, 3 points on our whites, -3 on our darks, and -4 on our shadows. That's going to give us just a little bit of extra contrast throughout, kind of a nice subtle parabolic tonal curve. All right, moving down into my hue, saturation, and luminance panel, I'm definitely seeing a lot of maybe a little bit extra too much brightness in these yellows. They look cool, they pop out on the screen, but if you were ever to try to print this image, basically what's happening here is this amount of brightness plus this amount of color saturation is going to turn your ink from your inkjet printers or from whatever your dye sublimation printers, it's just going to turn that into soup. The algorithm is going to tell the computer there's so much color information here that you've just got to spray paint the heck out of this part of the scene. And your ink tends to look a little bit soupy, to coin a term. So let's start with luminance. Let's grab our yellows and let's look at how we can affect just the yellow. So this is a really nice way of doing that. I want to be subtle. Again, you know, a lot of the yellow leaves are reflecting some super bright colors. So let's bring those down just a little bit. And let's come down on my greens just a tad there. And then in color saturation, let's ease back off of those yellows just a tiny little bit. Again, so here, if I bring this all the way down, the vast majority of the color information in this file is in fact yellow. So we want to be careful about getting too hypercolor. If I put this all the way to the right, again, I just got this soupy, oversaturated craziness. So I'm going to bring this down just a few points. Let's go with -4, just to be on the safe side. That looks pretty good right there. Again, we still have an enormous amount of color information, so don't worry about subtracting a little bit of color out of your file. All right, another thing, let's go over to hue. Now I'm detecting a lot of green in this image, and I really love it when we get this mixture of green and yellow in our forest, because it just gives a little bit of an extra kind of color dynamic range to the scene. And so these trees were kind of in the middle of turning. They weren't 100% yellow, but I really like that. I really like that we have a variety of color and it's not just a monochromatic wash of yellow. Now, as we have discussed in previous episodes, the camera's sort of color matrix and the color sensor does typically tend to actually have a lot of yellow information in our greens. So let's go over, and what I want to do is I want to separate the kind of color matrix between yellow and green a little bit stronger. So if I take my green slider right here and I move him a little bit more towards the aquamarine, watch what happens. I'm going to put him all the way to one side, and now you can see the greens are really causing a great deal of differentiation against the yellow. I definitely have a very strong green palette and a very strong yellow palette. As I move the slider back towards the middle, the greens tend to become a little bit more yellow. They're sort of blurring together with the yellow. They're still there, they're still apparent, but what I want to do is I want to separate that out a little bit. So we're obviously not going to go hypercolor because again, that's ridiculous, but I just want to throw a couple of points over here and kind of start edging my greens in the direction of a little bit more green, a little bit more aquamarine. And I can do that with yellow as well. Again, the yellow tone curve does kind of split off to the green just a little bit as we move to the right. I could basically make this entire thing super green. So we've got this weird lime electricity going on here. But again, I don't want to do that. Let's just ease off a few points to the right, and that will really help to kind of let my greens come out and sort of have their own identity. These two edits might actually be a little bit too strong for me now that I'm looking at things. Things are starting to look a little bit artificial down here. So let's back both of these edits off. I'm just going to go with 15 and 20. That should really start to separate our green color tonality away from the yellows and give us a little bit more variety in our color palette. All right, that is looking pretty good. I don't think I would do much else to this file. So let's look at this in comparison to our other two. Let's start over here on the left. And again, this is our kind of fundamental raw file straight out of the camera. It's a little bit flat and it definitely is very yellow because we've got all of that yellow ambient light bouncing around the forest. As I move to the right, here is my edited file. This is the central version of the panorama, and you can tell that we have definitely brought out a lot of differentiation in those aspen trees, and we've brought out a lot of differentiation in the green and yellow leaves. And as we move to the right side of the panel, again, we're back to the regular raw file. Again, it's a little bit flat, and we have lots and lots of yellow ambient light bouncing around the forest. So let's just do a quick, simple little synchronization. I'm going to select this first file, and then I'm going to select these others. We'll go down into sync settings, and Lightroom will basically just do all of the same edits against those two new files that we did on our initial file. So now when I look across my aspen forest, I too, once again, have beautiful green differentiating out from my yellow. I've got nice white aspen stalks sticking up, again, creating a great deal of color differentiation between the leaves of the forest. Here's my central version, and over here is my right version. Okay, again, we didn't have to create any super duper raw files for major exposure variations. This is one of the reasons why I absolutely love shooting in the forest on a cloudy day. You typically get this nice soft light, which enables you to build out everything that you need from a single raw file. It's a little bit less work and it's a little bit more fun. Now, as I look at this image right now, it is still looking a little bit oversaturated. There is a lot of color going on here, and again, I don't want to oversaturate my image. I am, however, going to leave all of this color in place as we export these raw files out of Lightroom, and I think that once we get them into Photoshop, we will be able to extract just a small amount of colors so that the scene does go back to looking very natural. This, again, is just a little bit too much color, but that's okay. We can produce a little bit too much color in our raw editing workflow as long as we kind of dial it back at the last minute in Photoshop. Okay, that's gonna do it for this lesson. Again, that was pretty quick and easy. We started off with 15 files bracketed from -2, -1, 0, +1, and +2 to create a 5 bracket range in each of 3 panoramic panels. So it took us 15 shots to arrive to these final 3 perfect images that we're now gonna use over in Photoshop to hand paint a really, really spectacular panoramic forest scene. So we'll see you in the next lesson.